Okay, welcome to chapter 3. We're going to be dealing with concepts of speciation and population. Um, One of the main questions that we're going to ask is how does speciation take place? Okay, how does species diversity begin? What do we mean by tolerance limits? And obtain a couple of examples. Um, what kind of interactions aid or hinder speciation? And why do species not reproduce up to their biotic potential? What is a biotic potential? So these are some of the outcomes that we're going to be learning in this first half. Okay, and we're going to start with the Darwinian concept of natural selection, the one of the main mechanisms of evolution. Um, so we say that adaptation is the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment. It is one of the most important concepts in biology. So we have the word traits, and traits is code for genetics. Okay, what is adaptation? Adaptation is having the ability to uh, take our genes in our offspring and having our offspring adapt to their environment. Okay, how do we do this? Well, the short answer is sexual reproduction. Okay, the whole purpose of sexual reproduction is to maximize the variability in genetics so that when we have offspring, their genetic makeup is as diverse as possible. Consequently, some of them at least will successfully adapt to their environment. That is the whole purpose behind sexual reproduction. And if you contemplate how expensive sexual reproduction is, material wise and energetically, you have to contemplate that adaptation must be very, very important if Mother Nature emphasizes the concept of sexual reproduction so strongly. So it is important. If we cannot adapt to our environment, we're not going to be around for very long. How do we adapt? We adapt by passing on genetic traits that allow us to be successful and competitive in our environment, and that's adaptation. Okay. Now, when you have a population of offspring, some of them are going to fare better than others. That's part of adaptation. The successful will be the ones that adapt the best are the ones that are going to thrive and have the most offspring and pass on their genetic variability further on the line. Okay, so adaptation takes place at the genetic level, and it takes place at the population level, at the organism level. Adaptation involves changes in population with characteristics that are passed from one generation to the next, and that's how we adapt slowly to our environment, one generation at a time. The process of the fittest individuals passing their traits to the next generation is called natural selection, while others reproduce less successfully. Now, one of the things I like to accent is this concept of fittest individuals. Okay, we have a misunderstanding of what the fittest individual means. We have this vision of this guy who is just in super shape and very healthy and very strong and very powerful, and he or she is a fittest individual. Not necessarily. Okay. To give you a counter example, in Central America, we have a plague called malaria. Okay. And what helps people survive malaria, believe it or not, is the incidence of sickle cell anemia. Now, is sickle cell a good thing? No. Oxygen, when we enter oxygen stress, In sickle cell anemia, the cells polymerize the hemoglobin, and they cannot obtain oxygen very effectively. So we can argue that sickle cell anemia is not a good thing to have. However, if you live in Central America and your intent is to survive malaria and you have no other tool at your disposal, guess what? Sickle cell is the answer. So individuals that are heterozygous for sickle cell happen to be the fittest individuals, even though they would not successfully finish a marathon, for example. Okay? So the fittest individuals are those individuals that are fittest or can adapt best to the environment around them. That's what the fittest individual is. Okay? And when these guys survive, what do? They pass their trace through genetic heredity to their progeny, and this event is called natural selection. Okay, very important. And here they give us another example of natural selection. This is so old that I think it's even brought up by Charles Darwin. How do giraffes end up with their long necks? Well, the trees ended up with foliage that was higher and higher and higher. So through various generations, we have selected for an animal that has a very long neck. And the reason I find this humorous is because every picture of a giraffe with a long neck is inevitably taken in a savanna where there is not a single tree that cannot be reached by, say, a horse. So, what is the adaptive advantage? Maybe we can argue that sometime in recent history this was true. Okay, but I mean, you can look around here. There's nothing where you need to have a long neck in order to consume it. Anyways, natural selection acts on traits into DNA. So, where do the traits come from to make some individuals more successful? Not surprisingly, as we just said, changes to DNA of individual called mutations occur, and these changes are inherited by the offspring. Um, I got, you know, typically mutations. If you picture the fact that a mutation is an error in the replication of DNA, you can argue that mutations usually do not aid, they hinder. And this is typically true. What happens is that every once in a while, an organism ends up with a large mutation that happens to be beneficial. And that's where this mutation gets to be incorporated and it benefits the offspring. Um, you want an example? How about the rhodopsin in your eye? Okay. Contemplate that we have rods and cones in our eye. The rods see black and white and gray, and the cones see red, cyan, and blue, if I remember correctly. Okay. We see the three primary colors. And you have to contemplate for a second, where do these three primary colors come from? Did Mother Nature come along and go, the best way that you're going to be able to see in my sun and this beautiful star that I put in front of you is if you use these three primary colors in your cones? No. We are making the argument that natural selection is a random process. So you cannot believe that Mother Nature guided us to have the three exact cones. Okay. So what happened? What happened is that we had an ancestor where a mutation took place and one set of cones turned into two. And this was a big hiccup. It was a big mutation. But now each one of those cones got to adapt individually in successive generations to an optimal color. And then later on, we had another mutation where we ended up with a third one. And we ended up with the three primary colors. Did it happen again? Probably. There was probably an ancestor there that had not three, but four different cones. We don't see it. Why not? Because we don't need it. The three primary colors is the optimal way to see. So natural selection tells us that if you have somebody who has three cones and somebody who has four cones, the one that's going to be best adapted to his environment is that individual that only has the three cones. So this guy with four cones in their eye is going to be selected against and is going to drop out from the genetic progeny. Okay? So these are not small mutations. These are huge mutations. And that happen a lot of times because I just gave you one example. Imagine the taste buds in your tongue, for example. You have a whole bunch of different taste buds. In order to end up with a different taste bud, a huge mutation had to take place where another taste bud appeared. Okay? And then there had to be a reason for keeping that taste bud. There had to be a reason for the progeny to use that taste bud. If there wasn't a reason, then that trait would not be selected for. And I'm going to tell you, early on in our evolution, the biggest reason for having a taste bud was to taste bitter. Because if you ate a plant and it tasted bitter, chances were that it was poisonous. So we ended up with a lot of taste buds in our tongue that can taste bitter. Now we drink bitter stuff all the time, like coffee. That's really good. So anyways, so these mutations, they occur and they usually don't help. But when they occur in mass, they pass on something that is essential to the offspring that allows them to fare better in their environment. Okay, so most mutations have little effect on fitness, and some can have a negative effect. But some, the large ones, happen to be useful in helping individuals exploit new resources or survive more successfully in new environmental conditions, which is essentially the argument I just gave you. Okay. Individual species will continue to evolve as a result of natural selection, with certain genetic combinations becoming more predominant. Why? Because those genetic combinations is what allows that progeny to adapt to its environment the best. Okay, all species live within limits. Okay, an organism's physiology and behavior allow it to survive only in certain environmental components. Excuse me, certain environments. Generally, there's some specific critical limiting factor, one, that keeps an organism from expanding everywhere. Ecologist Victor Schellhorn stated that each environmental factor has both a minimum and a maximum level of these tolerance limits. We have many tolerance limits beyond which a particular species cannot survive or is unable to reproduce. So every species has many tolerance limits, okay? But there is only one specific critical limiting factor that decides whether the species is going to survive or not. So let's take a look at this. All right, this is my notes. So I gotta convince this. There we go. So this is a cactus, right? This is a giant saguaro cactus, saguaro as in cigar, which grows in the dry, hot Sonora Desert of southern Arizona and northern Mexico, for example, is tolerant of extreme heat and drought. What are we talking about here? We're talking about tolerance limits, okay? So extreme heat. So there's a lot of, if you can envision a bell curve, there's a maximum and a minimum extreme heat that this cactus can live in. Drought, there's a certain drought that this cactus can live in, okay? That's it. So drought is a second tolerance limit that we have to look at. Intense sunlight and nutrient poor soils, but it is extremely sensitive to freezing. Oh, so therefore that freezing is what? That is the specific critical limiting factor. Everything else, the darn thing can cope with. It's too hot, I can cope with it. There's no nutrition in the soil, I can cope with it. It's not raining, I can cope with it. It gets very, very cold, I'm dying. Okay? I'm gonna die. So if it can cope with it, that's called a tolerance limits, and there's many of these. But if it cannot handle it at all, okay, that's called a specific critical limiting factor, and there's typically only one, okay? So a single winter night with a temperature below freezing for 12 or more hours kills growing tips on the branches, preventing further development. Because of this sensitivity, the northern edge of the saguaro's range corresponds to a zone where freezing temperatures last, not surprisingly, less than half a day at any time. Okay, let's take a look at this. Now we're going to take a look. Here's my little bell curve. See that? And what we have is we have an optimal growth range due to some resource. And then if you go too far in one direction, you have a zone of physiological stress. You go too much in the other direction, you have a zone of physiological stress. You go too far in one direction, you end up with a zone of intolerance. None of them live. You go too far in the other direction, you end up with a zone of intolerance. None of them live. Okay? So, tolerance limits affect species distribution. For every environmental factor, there's an optimal range within which a species lives or reproduces most easily. So abundance is high. The horizontal axis here could represent a factor such as temperature, rainfall, vegetation height, or availability of some resource. In other words, there's many, many different tolerance limits for a particular species. Okay, sorry about that. I keep on getting phone calls right in the middle of, of my presentation here. So we're going to go into what an ecological niche is, okay? And first, let's do some vocabulary. So habitat, come on, there you go. Habitat describes a place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. So your habitat, for example, would be your home. Or unless you're at school, then your habitat would be a school. Maybe a better definition of your habitat is the city of Cloud Falls, right? So it describes a place and environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. An ecological niche describes both the role played by the species in a biological community and the set of environmental factors that determine its distribution. What does that mean? Don't worry, this will become really easy. Okay, so first, a niche is where you fit somewhere. Okay, And contemporarily, when we talk about niches, we're usually talking about a niche in business. So to be successful in business, because it seems like every possible idea that anybody has been done. Do you notice that? So sometimes you look at it and you go, wow, how can I become an entrepreneur? How can I become a business owner? Every time that I plan to do X, Y, or Z, I find out that somebody has already done X, Y, or Z. Well, the answer is you have to find your own niche. So a niche is a little crevice, a little spot that nobody else has gone into. That's a niche. Then you can become an entrepreneur because you're hitting a business product that nobody else has thought of. Okay, so an ecological niche is kind of the same concept. It's a little crevasse. It's a little slit where you can fit. Okay, so let's start with the examples of what a generalist and a specialist is. So a generalist is like the black bear that tolerates a wide range of conditions. Okay, so we have the black bear. This is a generalist. What does a black bear eat? Well, a black bear can eat fish, it can eat deer, it can eat berries, it can eat roots. The darn thing can eat garbage. Okay, they're found at garbage dumps all the time. So this is what you would call an omnivore. It is a generalist. When are we going to get rid of black bears? No time soon, because if you're a generalist, you can adapt to your environment very, very nicely. So, in fact, this is the opposite of a niche. A generalist is somebody that can survive no matter where they are. Okay. On the other hand, species such as a giant panda are specialists and have a narrow ecological niche. What do panda eat? Bamboo. That's it. They don't eat fish. They don't eat deer. They don't eat berries. They don't eat roots. They don't eat anything except bamboo. Who made these bears? That is a very, very narrow ecological niche. Now, not surprisingly, panda bears are endangered species. Why? Because if you want to get rid of this bear, all you have to do is get rid of his food supply, which happens to be bamboo. And then, as if that wasn't enough, bamboo is not really very high on calories. So these guys have to spend the majority of their waking life eating bamboo to assimilate enough calories for survival. It's crazy. So that's a niche. Koala bears, right? Koala bears. If you ever held a koala bear, um, they smell like you're holding a cold drop in your hands because all they eat is eucalyptus trees, nothing else. Only one thing. That is a narrow ecological niche. Okay, and we're going to go in detail as to why that is significant. We have the competitive exclusion principle. This is important. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy the same ecological niche for long, because you have two different species fighting for the same resources. That's not going to happen for long. The one that is more efficient at using available resources will exclude or remove the other. Okay, the other species disappears or develops a new niche exploiting resources differently, a process known as resource partitioning. And this resource partitioning is very interesting because a resource partitioning could be geographical, which means where they get their resources. It might be temporal, which means when they get the resources. Okay, but at any point, what happens when you have competition is that somebody somewhere is going to have to produce a resource niche. And this is done again through what's called resource partitioning. Partition can allow several species to utilize different parts of the same resource and coexist within a single habitat. That's the whole purpose, okay? So we're gonna look at warblers. This is a common example, okay? And here's a conifer in the middle, an evergreen. And this conifer supports arguably different species of this warbler because each warbler is confined to a very specific section within that conifer. So you might have warblers that specialize in very small insects and they would live very high up in the conifer. You might have some that specialize on the seeds that come off the conifer. They would live further down on the conifer. You might have some that depend on the shoots coming off the conifer. They would have a different geography. This is what? This is resource partitioning. So a different species can live within a single resource by essentially geographically partitioning that resource among themselves. Okay. Speciation leads to species diversity. The development of a new species is called speciation. What does this mean? What this means is that early on, most of these warblers were probably very closely related to each other. But over time, they became, some were better adapted at eating small insects. Others were better adapted at eating seeds. Others were better adapted at eating shoots. And after a while, this becomes a mating group, a mating population. And when this guy ceases to mate with this gal, because they happen to belong to two different geographic ecological niches, speciation is taking place. That's where it happens. They have ceased mating together, okay? In the Galapagos, finches speciation occurred largely because of geographic isolation. So here we're talking about warblers. In the Galapagos Islands, we had something very, very similar, but that took place with finches, okay? Speciation that occur when populations are geographically separated is known as allopatric speciation. So this is a different animal, okay? Imagine that you have a thriving population. They're at a park, and then a catastrophe takes place, a tsunami or an earthquake takes place, and it separates, or a fire, and it separates the park into two different places. Now you have animals stuck on one side and animals stuck on the other side that used to be part of a single breeding population. But because they have they have been geographically separated, they no longer mate together. They mate within their own groups, and speciation takes place. This event is called allopatric speciation. Allopatric means alternate fatherland. In other words, the other place. Speciation taking place because there's another place, okay? Now, behavioral isolation can result in speciation that occurs within one geographic area and is known as sympatric speciation. Sym means the same fatherland or same geography, okay? This event is typically temporal. So let's say that you have a breeding population, the resources can't handle the breeding population. So one solution is that have the breeding population uh, forages during the day, and the other half of the population forages at night. You might ask yourself, how is that a solution? Well, the types of animals that are out during the day are very different than the types of animals that are there during the night. So even though they're in the same geographic area, different resources or niches are being harvested, and that's called sympatric speciation. So here's an example of allopatric speciation. This is the, I forget, I think it's the um, red-tailed squirrel. Geographic isolation can lead to allopatric. For example, in cool, moist glacial periods, Arizona was forested and red squirrels interbred freely. As the climate warmed and dried, desert replaced the forest on the plains, isolating the remnants on on mountains. Populations became reproductively isolated and began to develop different traits. So this is the way that they started. It was a single mating population, and then because of lack of precipitation, we ended up with a dry plain separating the population, and we ended up with what? The other. Okay, so this one place is the other fatherland, allopatric speciation. Okay, this gets really this is the interesting because this is speciation as pressures take place. So you can have a shift towards one extreme. This is called directional selection. Sometimes it can be, the bell curve can be turned even thinner. That's called a stabilizing selection. And sometimes a single bell curve turns into two or three bell curves, and that's called disruptive selection. So imagine that this is your original curve, and then for whatever reason, insects are become more and more rare. So we end up with birds that only have thick bills that can eat seeds. That would be a directional selection. We have selected towards one type of bird, those that can eat seeds. Okay. Or insects become scarce, seeds become scarce. So we're going to go for those that can only eat uh, uh, the the uh, the new shoots on the tree, and consequently, we end up with what's called stabilizing selection. So notice that here in the original bell curve, it's normalized, but it's nice and broad. And over here, this is normalized, but it is not broad. It is very narrow. This is a stabilizing selection. And then we have disruptive. Okay, what happens? We end up losing a resource in the middle, and you end up with a single population moving towards two or three different non-interbreeding populations. This is called disruptive selection. Very, very neat. Okay, we're switching gears here. I used to skip this, but I found out that in microbiology, my pre-nursing students did not know what taxonomy was, and it drove me a little bit crazy. Okay, taxonomy is a study of types of organisms and their relationships. Um, let's see. What we care about is the fact that uh, most textbooks are being rewritten right now, and most of them now classify all life into three general domains according to cell structure: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay, so bacteria used to be still called prokarya, meaning before the karya. What's a karya? It's a nucleus. So both of these are precedent, in other words, before their ancestors to eukarya. Eukarya is eu, which means true nucleus. That's what that means. Karya actually means thimble, but that's because when we first looked at a nucleus under a microscope, they thought that it looked like a thimble. So this is true thimble or true nucleus. This is bacteria, prokarya, without a nucleus. And then we have archaea. Okay. There's two giants, Margolis and Woos, that have been fighting over this. And I can't wait to see what's gonna happen next, because I think they both passed. We had Woos pass, and I think Margolis just passed. And there's an old saying in science that change happens one death at a time. So what we mean by that is, you have these giants which are Nobel laureates, and while they're around, science stagnates because nobody wants to argue against them. But now that they're not around, let's see what happens. But it was Carl Woos that protected this domain structure right here. And um, bacteria is a bacteria that you and I know. Eukarya is anything that has a nucleus. So we're talking about plants, animals, fungi, everything that has a nucleus. And then archaea are very ancient, kind of like bacteria, but they're very, very ancient. And so these guys have a tendency to be extremophiles. They have a tendency to like to live in the very hot, the very cold, the very acidic. Why? Because early on in the Earth's evolution, the environment was very hot. It was very cold. It was very acidic. It was very saturated with heavy metals. Okay, and that's where these guys evolved, and so consequently, they are extremophiles. They love extreme conditions. Um, the organisms that we are most accustomed to are the four kingdoms of eukarya, those that have a nucleus, which consists of the animals to which we belong, plants, fungi, and protista, which are the uh, well, single-celled and multi-celled animals that are very simple in structure. Okay, so here's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Here's protista, plantae, uh, uh, fungi, and animalia, the four kingdoms. Okay, within these four kingdoms are a million of different species. Um, Scientists usually use the two most specific levels of taxonomy, the genus and the species, to refer to the species. Okay. Now, this is the reason that this is important in microbiology. If you write the genus and the species, which now is also called the specific epithet, this has to be capitalized. This one is never capitalized, and they are both italicized. And I gotta tell you, it's one of my pet peeves to see a genus and a species that is not italicized. It has to be italicized. Okay. This two-part binomial name, also called the scientific or Latin name, are more precise than common names. Okay. So let's do us. Here's corn. You can do corn if you want to. I'm just gonna do us. So at the very top we have the kingdom, and we belong to Animalia. So we're in there with the whales and the lancelets and the sponges and everything else. And then we go to the phylum, and we become a little bit more specific. Now we're in there with everybody that has a notochord. So lancelets, whales, elephants, anybody that has a notochord as an infant in the womb belongs to the same phylum as we do. And then we go to the class, And now we're in there with only animals that provide milk to their infants, like whales and like elephants and like cows and gorillas. Okay. And then we go down to the order, and we're in the order of primates with the great apes. And then we go to the family, and we're in Hominidae, which is a set of the primates. And then we go to the genus, and we're in Homo. Homo means the same. And the reason that we're in the genus Homo is because there's nobody else in that genus. We're it. We're all the same. And then we're in the species, we are Homo, which is a genus, and the specific epithet, sapien. So this is the species, Homo sapien. Sapien, incidentally, means wise. So we're the wise ones. And then the subspecies is Homo sapiens sapiens. We're the double wise ones. So obviously we think very highly of ourselves. We are the double wise ones. Okay. Sometimes you wonder about these things. I think some of us are just Homo sapien. Anyways, be that as it may, I don't know if this rings a bell, but the mnemonic device is King Philip came over for good soup. That'd be soup. King Philip came over for good soup. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay? Species interactions. Okay. Let's see here. So one of the main interactions in species is competition. This is competition because it leads to resource allocation. In other words, it leads to ecological niches. Okay. Competitions among members of the same species is called intra-specific competition. So when you and your girlfriend are competing for the same guy, or conversely, don't get upset, when you and your a guy friend are competing for the same girl, that is intra-specific competition. And the reason I brought out that example is because if you think that we're studying animals here, we are studying animals. We're part of them. Okay. If you think there's interspecific competition going on in the wild, the interspecific competition going on in humans is even worse. Right. So interspecific competition with us, it gets very interesting. Right. What are we competing for? Well, we're competing for somebody who is aesthetically pleasing. We're competing for somebody who is healthy. We're competing for somebody that can be a good mother or a good father. We're competing for somebody who is educated. We're competing for somebody who is wealthy, makes a good living. We're competing. We're always competing. We're always competing. We're trying to get the very best hand that we can. We're always competing. Okay. Only in what's that show? Roxanne. I want to say Roxanne, but that's not right. Um, they make a joke about we stopped competing, we settled. Okay. Typically, people don't stop competing. We are always competing in our species. Competition between members of different species is called interspecific competition. And to be sincere, we're not really well known for our interspecific competition. We usually win, right? It's not like it's going to be us and cows. It's not going to be us and goats. It's not going to be us and penguins. No matter what, we're usually the ones that win. So in the wild, interspecific competition is more important, but within our life, intraspecific competition is very important. So your author puts this little picture here, and what Cunningham and Cunningham are trying to demonstrate is a competition among various plants for rain and for nutrients, and in particular for sunlight. Okay, so these plants are trying to grow on top of each other. They're trying to climb on top of each other, all so that they can get a little glimpse of sunlight so they can carry out some photosynthesis. So a lot of competition going on out there. Okay, this is important. This is important. Several avenues exist to reduce competition within a species. The first two are pretty much similar. The difference is who's doing the driving. In the first, the young of the year can disperse. Young animals move in search of new territories in plants, seeds, travel with wind, water, or passing animals, and at least some land in available habitat away from the parent plants. So we're moving away. Who's doing the moving? The young. Motif number two, second, is identical, but who's doing the moving is somebody else. By exhibiting strong territoriality, many animals force their offsprings or other trespassers out of their vicinity. In this way, territorial species such as bears, songbirds, ungulates, and fish minimize competition between individuals and generations. So same outcome. It's just that here is the young that's driving it. Here it is the adults that are driving it. A third way to reduce interspecific competition is resource partitioning. This is very important between generations. The adults and juveniles of these species occupy different ecological niches. An example, most insects work this way. So you can look at a butterfly, right? Before it turns into a butterfly, it consumes leaves. After it becomes a butterfly, it consumes nectar. So what does it say? A third way to reduce interspecific competition is resource partitioning between generations. The adults and juveniles of these species occupy different ecological niches by consuming different aspects of the ecology. This is very, very important, this last one. Okay. Here we go. Here's that third concept again. Predatory relationships may change with life stage. In marine ecosystems, crustaceans, mollusks, and worms release eggs directly into the water, where they and hatching larvae join the floating plankton community. Planktonic animals eat each other and are food for larger carnivores, including fish. Predators often switch prey in the course of their lives. So this last sentence is a key sentence. Predators often switch prey in the course of their lives. So when you have a complex life system, each part of that predator consumes different parts of the surrounding ecology. And again, that's going back to this concept of reducing interspecific competition by having different stages occupy different ecological niches. Coevolution. This is very, very cool. I love coevolution. Okay, so predation leads to adaptation. And does anybody recognize what this beautiful little guy is here? This is called a dart frog. Okay, it grows in the jungles of South America, and we used to think that it made a poison called curare. We have since found out that the frog doesn't produce the poison. What the frog does is it has special organs in its mouth that harbor bacteria that produce a curare. Uh, why do we care? Because they're cute. And it would be nice to own a pretty little frog that isn't going to kill you. That'd be kind of neat, right? So anyways, if you're to harvest the curare from this cute little guy, 1 gram of that curare can kill about 50,000 men. 50,000. So what does this mean? It means that dart frogs really hate men. No, that's not what it means. What it means is that there had to be some kind of coevolution taking place for this adaptation, okay? And what as it turns out, what's going on is that there's a snake in the jungle that happens to think that dart frogs are just yummy. They make a great omelet in the morning, okay? And this snake has adapted to make antibodies against this curare, against this poison. So what does the frog do? The frog produces more curare. What does the snake do? Well, it still likes this yummy little toad, so it makes more antivenom. What does the frog do? It makes more curare. What does the snake do? It makes more antivenom until we end up into this escalating war where a frog can produce enough poison to kill 50,000 men. Where does it end? Well, it ends right there because a frog cannot produce any more poison and the snake cannot produce any more antivenom. So who won? Well, as it turns out, the snake can still eat this delicious little guy, okay? But it takes him 20 minutes for the antibodies to neutralize the poison from the frog. And what happens during those 20 minutes is that the snake cannot move because it's too busy synthesizing antibodies. I don't know about you, but if you're in the jungles of South America, you do not want to be lying around for 20 minutes. That is bad juju. So consequently, sometimes the snake gets its omelet and sometimes it doesn't, because even though it eats a frog, the chance for a predator to come by and consume the snake during those 20 minutes is actually pretty good. So who won? Nobody. It's kind of a stalemate. Aren't they delicious looking though? I'm just kidding. I don't eat frogs. Here's another adaptation, camouflage. Isn't this awesome? So this is what's called a walking stick, okay? So species display forms, colors, and patterns that help them hide. Insects that look exactly like dead leaves or twigs are among the most remarkable examples. What I dig about this, have you ever seen a walking stick? First of all, the reason that you realize that it's a walking stick is because it's moving and sticks aren't supposed to move, okay? But when it does move, it does this little thing, like it's vibrating, because it's trying to pretend that it's not walking. It's wind that's pushing it, see? And so that wind is making it move along. So it's part of its camouflage. Even the way that it walks is camouflage. This is so awesome. I love these things. This is another one, okay? Certain species that are harmless resemble poisonous or distasteful ones. Gain protection against predators, or remember a bad experience with the actual toxic organism. My apologies. Toxic organism. So what are we saying here? We're saying that this is a wasp, bad news. This is a beetle, no big deal, right? Okay. This one's going to sting you and is going to hurt a lot. This one is probably going to stink. Bad news, not that big of a deal, right? But this guy looks a lot like this guy. So coevolution has made it look like a wasp because predators will think twice about attacking anything that's yellow and black, like this angry little wasp over here. That is called Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry. Okay. Now, if you have two equally unpalatable or dangerous species that look alike, then that's called Mullerian mimicry, and they reinforce each other's defenses. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to move into symbiosis. Symbiosis is a process where two or more species live intimately together with their fates linked. Okay. So we have mutualism, which means that both species clearly benefit. We have commensalism, one member benefits and the other apparently is neither benefited or harmed. And they have parasitism, one partner benefits while the other is harmed. Okay. So let's see. Our author starts with pollinators. Okay. So it says many plants and pollinators have forms and behaviors that benefit each other. Many moths, for example, are adapted to pollinate particular flowering plants. So if they both benefit, then that is mutualistic. Now you might think, how are they benefiting? The moth is getting nutrients and the plant is being pollinated. Okay, the moth is facilitating the sexual reproduction of the plant. Symbiotic relationships often enhance the survival of one or both partners. Okay, so we have here's an example. In lichens, a fungus and a photosynthetic partner, either an alga or a cyanobacterium, combine tissues for mutual benefit. The fungus provides structure and moisture holding ability, and the relationship is best described as mutualism. So what's mutualism? Both species clearly benefit. What is a fungus providing? It is providing structure and moisture holding. What is a photosynthetic partner providing? It is providing the products of photosynthesis, sugar. And actually, even further than that, the fungus in lichens also has enzymes that break rocks down. So it's providing minerals for the symbiotic relationship. So this is a very powerful symbiotic relationship. Coevolution. Oh, this is one of my favorite examples. So it says coevolution has led to close evolutionary relationships between many species, as in this star orchid and the specially adapted hawk moth that pollinates it. Okay, there's a long story behind this. And your author just kind of throws it out there and doesn't follow through with it. Makes me kind of sad. So I did the work for you. Okay, let's see if I can find it here. Where did I put it? I put it right there. And there we go. Even better. Okay. So we're looking at this little guy right here. Let's see. It is called A. sesquipedale. A. sesquipedale. And no, I need to go back to where I was. There we go. And if you type that in into Google, A. sesquipedalia, you end up with this star orchid. Okay. Who cares? Well, we do, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it, right? Essentially what happened is that we ran to this beautiful orchid And the darn thing had a throat on it to a nectarine that was a foot long. A foot long. What does this mean? This means that if this orchid is going to be pollinated, there has to be something out there in nature with a 12-inch proboscis that can go all the way to the bottom of the throat and grab the nectar out of there. And there was a long argument for a long time going, no, there's no such animal. There's nothing out there with a proboscis that is 12 inches long. Well, lo and behold, guess what? Yes, there is. So there's this giant moth. Okay, there's this giant moth with a proboscis that is exactly that. It is 12 inches long. Okay. And this is no small moth. I mean, if this moth is flying around you, you would confuse it with a bird. This is huge, right? Now, what's the hiccup with this? The hiccup is that since then, we have found additional orchids with nectarine throats that are 18 inches, 20 inches. And the question is, oh my goodness, is there really something in nature with a proboscis that's 18 and 20 inches or 2 feet long that can reach the bottom of this nectarine? And I got to tell you, we were afraid to ask the question because that would be one huge moth. But apparently, the answer is yes. Not because we've seen the moth, but because these orchids keep on reproducing. And the only way that that can happen is that they have been cross-pollinated by a giant moth that is yet to be identified. Okay? But the hypothesis that that giant moth exists is a consequence of coevolution. If this star orchid exists and it has a nectarine that's 12, 16, 18 inches long, then coevolution implies that there must be an equally large moth with a proboscis equally long that can reach all the way down there. Incredible, isn't it? So very, very neat. Okay, let's review our symbiotic relationships here. What do we have? Mutualism. Effects on the first species are good. Effects on the second species are good. Commensalism. Effects on the first species are good. Effects on the second species, non-existent. Parasitism. Effects on the first species are good. Effects on the second species are bad. This guy is hurting somebody. Predation. Effects on first species good. Effect on second species bad. Competition. Effect on first species good and bad. Effects on second species good and bad. Okay. So here's, let's see, likeness or mutualistic relationships between fungi and algae, right? So here's mutualistic relationship. What does that mean? They both benefit, right? Mutualistic relationship between parasite eating red-billed oxpecker, there's the red-billed oxpecker, and the parasite infested impala. It's so cute, okay? And then the common satellite bromeliad grows in the trunk of a tropical tree. What does commensal mean? Do you guys remember? One benefits, the other one is not harmed. So bromeliads benefit from growing on trees, but the tree is not harmed. Same thing with orchids. Orchids are known to be epiphytes, which literally means above trees. They grow there, they take a little bit of rain, they grow roots that pick up rain, but they do not hurt the tree in any way, shape, or form. So that's a commensal relationship. Keystone species. Keystone species, we're going to talk a little bit about complex ecosystems and how a complex ecosystem is defined by a complex trophic system. In other words, a system where the feeding um, the feeding levels are complicated. Okay, and in these trophic levels of these ecosystems, you typically have one organism that is of particular interest, of particular significance, and we call that species a keystone species. Why? Because this keystone species is representative of the health of its environment. If that keystone species is thriving, then that means that its ecology, its environment is also thriving. If that keystone species is being depleted, then that means that that ecosystem is also being depleted. It is inextricably connected to the ecosystem, and it is also an indicator of the health of that ecosystem. That is called a keystone species. Originally, keystone species were thought to be only top predators. That's not necessarily true. Now scientists realize that the effect of the keystone species on communities ripples across multiple trophic levels. So in other words, if you get rid of the keystone species, it doesn't break one trophic level, it breaks multiple trophic levels, subsequently possibly destroying the ecosystem. Okay, and that's where we're going to end on the first part. Thank you for paying attention. I'll be back in just a moment.